welcome back, you absolute weapons, to the Sports Medicine Project. Kelly and I this is the most excited we've ever been for this episode. We've got Dr. Sian Allen, who we do a pretty good introduction in the episode, but basically she's done her PhD in statistical modelling of sports performance over in New Zealand. She's worked with athletes, Olympic, Paralympic, and now she works with Lululemon. And basically they're trying to combine data analytics with the latest in technology and scientific research. I mean, that just sounds incredible. And I know everyone wears a smartwatch. I wear two, Kelly wears two, all our patients wear smartwatches. And, you know, the way that we're moving now with technology and even just data technology, I can't see in the next 10 years everyone not having a smartwatch. And I can't not see the technology getting to the point where it's just exponentially better than what it is now. And
even currently, as you said, so many people wear smartwatches, but maybe not everyone has a great understanding of how to actually interpret the information.
Yeah, you're right.
It's only as useful as what you can make of it. So I think actually knowing what it means and how to best use it for yourself and your patients or as a coach or as an athlete is really, really important. So we get into that a lot throughout this chat, and Blake and I got heaps out of it. I know you guys will as well.
Yeah, and I cannot see the argument for, and we talk about this in the episode, I can't see the argument for not collecting this data. I mean, obviously we're a little bit biased, and so is Sian, that your body produces or goes through, has these systems that produce these outcomes. So if we can measure those outcomes, we've got somewhat of an idea of how those systems are behaving. Like, I just can't see, and definitely in the future, implications for injury, performance, just general health, people with comorbidities. I mean, we know you can wear those the glucose monitors on your arm. Imagine if every diabetic in the world had one of those on, and every time their BGLs went to a certain level, you know, it beeped or something happened. I mean, how many ulcerations, amputations would that prevent? Let alone how that would translate to performance if you're a triathlete or a runner, and understanding when you need to have your gels or your nutrition. Like, that is the future of this technology. So I'm on the train. I know Kelly's on the train, and let's get into it. Enjoy, legends.
Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Project. Blake and I are super excited today for our guest. Today we have Dr. Sian Allen, all the way from British Columbia via Zoom. Blake and I have been a little bit of a nerds over wearable technology, so we're super excited to pick her brain and hear all about it. So in a way of bio, Sian has spent over 10 years providing sports science support to athletes and coaches in Olympic, Paralympic and professional sports across high performance environments in Great Britain and New Zealand. She obtained her PhD in statistical modelling of sports performance data from AUT University while working with Swimming New Zealand. Sian then took up a strategic role as a performance intelligence manager with Paralympics New Zealand into Rio 2016 Games. She now combines data analytics with the latest in technology and scientific research, working as a research manager in the product innovation team at Lululemon Athletica. Thanks so much for coming on, Sian.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's a bio and a half. Like, I've got a couple of things in my bio, but it definitely doesn't take that long to read out. That's awesome. You've been busy.
It's probably too much, isn't it?
No, not at all. Not enough, I reckon.
Yeah, so how, I guess, to where you are now, because you're with Lululemon, so like, how did you, I guess, start university to where you are now?
Yeah, so I started out in the UK. I was studying sports science, and after that, I studied exercise physiology as my master's, and then I sort of knew, I want to stop studying for a while and try and work a little bit. And that's when I got my first job in Scotland, and I was working with the British swimming team in the lead up to the London 2012 Games as a performance scientist. And actually, when I think about it now, a lot of what I was doing was collecting physiological data on athletes, the same kind of data that we get from wearables automatically. So in the morning, we'd measure their resting heart rate, HRV, like a sleep questionnaire, take a blood sample to look at their glucose, that kind of thing. And we had all this data to look at how we could optimize their recovery and training and performance. And that's when I started getting really curious about this stuff. And I wanted to then dive a bit deeper. And that's when I went to do my PhD, which was more in data analysis of athlete performance data over in New Zealand. And so I was there for a little while working with athletes and looking at performance data and that kind of thing. And then I started to think about, hey, what about like the rest of the world, not just elite athletes? Maybe they could benefit from some of these kind of concepts and analysis methods as well. And that's when I got interested in kind of working in industry. And that kind of prompted me to move to Canada to work with Lululemon, where I've been using kind of data and science and those kind of things to look at bringing more like products and experiences to the mass market. So yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Yeah. Wow. So
That's cool.
how did you, I guess, come together with Lululemon?
Yeah, so I had a couple of friends actually that were working there from that I knew from kind of back in the UK and in New Zealand, and they had a job open up, and they sort of sent it to me and said, hey, would you be interested in this? And I looked at the company, and the company has such a great kind of brand presence and such a great like reach in terms of people in that kind of health and wellness and fitness space, that I thought, yeah, this is an amazing platform to be able to maybe take some of the skills that I have from just a few elite athletes to reach potentially like millions or even billions of people worldwide.
Yeah, wow. And like back in 2012, how were you doing the testing then? Like HR, like obviously Kelly and I both wear Whoops, but you know, it's just we log onto our phone and it's there and it's done. Like, how were you doing it? Were you doing it with, did they have something like this back then, or what were you using?
No, we were just using the chest straps. So like the regular kind of polar chest straps, we would often give them to the athletes to put on first thing in the morning when they woke up, and perhaps do like an HRV test, which took between 3 to 5 minutes and also captured their resting heart rate. And then I was working with swimmers, so they would come into the pool. Sometimes before training, we would just take like a tiny amount of blood from their finger or from their ear, and we would put it through machines that we had to analyze their glucose levels sometimes, or creatine kinase, which is often a marker of muscle soreness and muscle damage, to help us make some decisions about should they continue on the training plan that we have for them today, or should we make it a little bit easier, a little bit harder, based on basically how fatigued or ready they were to train that particular day.
So do they still use that? Or is it just off the wearables and technology now?
Yeah, I mean, I think different places do different things, but certainly what the wearables do is they give you back a lot of time. So now you get the data at a click of a button. So as a sports scientist, you can spend more time actually looking at the data and saying, well, what does this mean? Or you can spend more time having conversations with the athletes to say, oh, I noticed that your HRV was a bit low. Why was that? What time did you go to bed? What did you eat for dinner last night? How do you feel? Are you stressed? That kind of thing. Whereas before, it took so long to gather the data that it was really hard to action it, because you didn't always have the time to go into it as deeply as you do now. So I think there's probably still a combination of both, but certainly wearables make it much easier.
Yeah, cool. And can you explain to us and everyone exactly what heart rate variability or HRV is? Because I think that some people get a little bit confused about what that metric actually means, and it seems as though it is almost a little bit new, particularly for clinicians that we talk to. Not many know a lot about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the clue, I like to think about it as the clue is in the name. It's literally the variation in time between each heartbeat. So say my resting heart rate is 60 beats per minute. I don't just have one heartbeat every second. There could be a gap of like 1.2 seconds between two heartbeats. And then the next one is 0.8, and the next one is 0.6. And so you look at that variation or the difference between each of those differences between heartbeats, and that's your heart rate variability. So generally what it means is the higher the better, because you have more of that variation. So it's almost as if it's a measure of your autonomic nervous system, or essentially like the stress balance that your body is in. And almost if you have more variability, I've heard it referred to as you're potentially more ready to respond to threats, because you're able to like amp up if you need to, or you're able to amp down if you need to, because you have those gears, versus if you're just kind of flatlining and you can't really respond to a stressor as it comes your way. So that's in a nutshell how I like to think about it.
And
yeah, even on the Whoop explanation, and I've heard this before, and you were saying like the balance between the autonomic nervous system described as like the pull between like parasympathetic and sympathetic, like changing. Is that really simplified and probably not accurate, or you could nearly describe it as that?
Yeah, so I think perhaps it's a bit of a myth that only one of those systems is working at any given time. It's actually both of those systems are working, and it's almost the balance between them. And there are almost hundreds of different metrics of heart rate variability that you can choose to measure, and some of which give you a better idea of how much sympathetic balance you have versus parasympathetic. So that's one of the things that can be confusing for people, but the metrics that you often see in the kind of common apps like Whoop and Aura and those kinds of things, they're giving you a general kind of state of what that autonomic balance is between the two systems.
Yeah, because like I mean, I definitely love the objective stuff, and I can understand obviously how you take it in is important, but like we both do triathlon and train within our like in our triathlon group, and obviously everybody uses heart rate for to I guess what heart rate to sustain during a race. You know, it's going, if you can't get it too high, perhaps you got recovered, but HRV doesn't seem to be too common or used over here in Australia. Is it common for athletes to use over there, like just your general athletes?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a bit more nuanced, which means there's definitely been more attention given to it in like the elite athlete population, and there is some great work happening in terms of trying to translate it to everyone and make it more actionable. I don't know if you've seen the HRV for Training app, but that's one that I usually recommend as one that gives you like really robust, valid measurements and helps you understand what it means for you, like no matter what your athletic level is. But I think one of the key things that I've seen in terms of what to look for, it's almost the variation of the HRV. So if you're having lots of ups and downs, really big peaks and troughs, that generally means that you're not responding super well to training, versus if you're having more of a kind of steady state, because the actual values themselves are very individual. Like I've heard it said that up to 80% of the variation in someone's baseline score is just genetic. So you can't really control whether your HRV is really high or really low to begin with.
Yeah, I was going to ask that, is there a normal or something that people should sort of strive for, or is it just your normal and you need to sort of work around what your normal is?
Yeah, I think
we're very different.
Yeah, he's in the hundreds. I'm like 50s. And it's like, can't compare.
Yeah, I definitely think it's more relevant to look at you against you and your trends over time. I mean, there are some trends that are kind of generically true, such as HRV typically declines with age. And there are like some kind of small effects of fitness and some of these kinds of things and some gender differences. But generally, it's like for you, what's your baseline? And then say you've done a hard training session or you've had something stressful going on, how have you responded to that? And it could be that doesn't necessarily show up the next day. It could be like the day after or the day after. And so you're kind of looking at more of these like rolling averages or trends over time. And again, looking at like, is there a lot of variation or is it more kind of stable to see like your general adaptation and how you're responding? And the other thing that's interesting as well is it's really like this all-encompassing measure of how your body's responding to stress. So it could be that your training is changing your result, or it could be that your life is really stressful, like you have lots going on at work or something like that, and that's all bundled together. So you have to then distinguish like, okay, is it my training or do I need to like ramp other things down in my life so I can respond better to training?
Because we like even seeing, like we see a lot of both work in sports medicine clinics, and then obviously this podcast being for kind of the sports medicine practitioner, probably the last maybe 10, 20 years, it was like injury or the development of an injury is very biomechanical, how you move, how you run, that kind of thing. But now we're starting to see, I guess, stress and psychosocial factors affect the development of an injury. And we're always, I guess, saying to patients, it's not just, what you've done in the gym or your training, it's your sleep, your stress at work, your relationships and things like that. And I do wonder if HRV, because we use things like the acute to chronic workload ratio and things like that, I wonder if HRV could be a predictor. Say if someone was wearing that and you could look at the general trend over the last 4 weeks and it was quite inconsistent, could you almost say that's quite a predictor of maybe stress, I guess, for them to take in? Yeah, or injury.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is like, that's what it's doing. It's almost giving you a sense of someone's acute response to stress, but on its own, it's really hard to interpret like a single number. What does that mean? Because there's so many factors behind the scenes. So I like to think about it as, if you see something like a lot of variation going on, like that's the trigger to start a conversation with an athlete or a patient and say like, hey, what's going on in your life? Do you have a lot of stress? Or like, what's explaining this stuff? Because sometimes it can be something that's like totally innocuous, or it uncovers something new that like you're not really aware of. And so on their own, I think it's pretty hard right now to be able to say, oh, like a 5% change in HRV is going to predict injury. It might say like there's a bit of a elevated risk perhaps, and that's when you want to have a conversation to be like, okay, what's going on? What can we do to start to maybe reduce your risk? But to say like, yeah, you're 100% going to get injured because of your HRV, like I don't think we're there, and I don't know if we ever will be.
And the accuracy of it, like, is it accurate enough that we could make a call that strong as well? With wearables of Aura and Whoop, for example?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things with HRV is there's a lot of nuances in how it's measured that affect how you might want to use it, like whether you measure at night versus whether you measure in the morning can tell you something slightly different. I think like what I always say with accuracy is it depends how big an effect that you're looking at in terms of like what you're trying to see. Because if your error of measurement is less than that effect, you'll still see it, if that makes sense. So the smaller the error of measurement is, the smaller the effect you're able to detect, basically. But generally the most accurate is if you're measuring with a chest strap when you wake up in the morning and following the same protocol at the same time of day. But if you're using like Whoop or Aura during the middle of the night and you're seeing like, hey, so this training is having a big effect on my stress response, like you're still going to see it. You might just not pick up some of those smaller signals, basically, that you could with the chest strap.
Is Polar I don't know, I mean, obviously different brands, different countries, but Polar over here seems to be like the chest strap, like the one to have. Do you have any recommendations on pretty accurate straps?
Yeah, I use the Polar H10, which is just the kind of standard chest strap, I suppose. I think Garmin has similar products like those ones are, I would recommend them for taking those kind of measurements and for measuring heart rate during exercise as well.
Yeah.
And how do they, so all of these wearables, how do they register heart rate and heart rate variability?
The big question.
Yeah, so the ones on your finger or your wrist, they're using something called PPG, which is like photoplethysmography, and they're optical sensors. So they're basically projecting light onto the skin, and it's absorbed through the skin and it's absorbed by blood and tissues, but it's absorbed differently by blood and by tissues. So if you can basically subtract the signal, you can figure out when blood volume is changing, and so when your heart's beating, basically, and you're getting that signal. But one of the interesting things about that, and some studies have been done to show that it doesn't work as well with people with different skin tones, or if you have tattoos, they potentially affect how the signal is being read. And depending on where you're wearing it on your wrist or how you're wearing it on your finger, what your blood circulation is like, these are all things that could affect accuracy and make it readings different for different people. Or if you're wearing it differently on different fingers or different days, then you could get some error in your data.
Have more muscle or more fat, would that affect it at all, or not really?
There have been some studies looking at like modeling that, like statistically, and they found that for people with a lot of adipose tissue, their readings would be less accurate. For people who are generally kind of fit and athletic, probably less so. But again, I haven't seen a study where they've properly tested it. So like theoretically, yes, but we don't really know how much or how relevant that is for like athletic populations in general.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess like if you're a company and it's scalable, you've just got to make one size fits all. Like there's no way to be able to, I guess, give it based on, I guess, skin tone, or if you've got tattoos and things like that. Because the sensor would have to be different, wouldn't it, if the skin's different?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people who have tattoos on their wrist wear the sensor the other way around. So it's like reading this way. Obviously, that's a little bit inconvenient for them. But I mean, I think like it's a big issue in like wearable technology in general, is like accessibility. And a lot of the algorithms that we use are trained on kind of a typical white male Western population, because that's who we have a lot of data from in research studies.
Yeah.
So if you're from a different population, then perhaps those algorithms are less relevant for you. And there's definitely like a lot of challenges in there for different populations.
I have a particular interest in working with female athletes, so it's just fascinating that so much of the research, majority of the research out there is done on 20-year-old males, and all of that information's just been generalized to females. So I guess with that in mind, is there any significant differences to consider with females versus males in terms of wearables, or is there anything to show that the readings or the accuracy or the utilization of them might be different?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think there's a lot we actually don't know because we are only working with such limited data. I think like I've certainly been probably more interested in kind of the optimistic side in terms of what we can learn about female health and physiology. And like for me, I found it really interesting. The variable that's been most interesting for me is the ability to measure body temperature. And Aura does that really nicely through their finger sensor, and it is in the Whoop band now, the 4.0.
It's in the Whoop 4.
Yeah, like what I've been able to see from that is it tracked really nicely to my menstrual cycle. And I think I've seen some research papers saying it's about 80% accurate roughly for being able to predict kind of when menstruation will occur, and to kind of let you know how like regular or not your cycle is potentially. And so there are obviously kind of applications for fertility and those kind of things, but also in terms of potential like training decisions you might want to make, or if there is any considerations around injury risk or anything like that. Like it can be an interesting tool for that. Instead of having to have kind of an awkward conversation about it, you potentially have some objective data to help people just, I think, tune into their bodies a bit more is what it's really about right now, and notice like, hey, at this particular time of the month, potentially I'm feeling like a bit more sore in my muscles, so maybe I should like do something a little bit differently, and just kind of fine tuning that awareness more than anything. So I think there is so much potential there and so much research that needs to be done. But for now, I think if you are a female or kind of an underserved population, you're seeing some things in your data that look a bit funny, like potentially like that's one of the reasons why. And I wouldn't freak out about it necessarily, but just know that like, these things are going to improve over time, hopefully, as they do get more kind of inclusive and broad data sets. But for right now, it might not be like completely representative of who you are as an individual.
That's so interesting.
Because you can share, like, I don't know if it's the same on the Aura, but on Whoop, you can share like your data, it's like share with your health professional, and it would share like the last couple of months, which obviously I haven't seen or heard too much application of that happening, but I'm sure in the the next several years that'll be hopefully become the norm. Because then obviously there's problems with the data, but at least it's objective and you're not trying to recall how things felt. And I guess you can just say, here it is, and this is what it was like.
Yeah, and I think like for me, it kind of comes back to what I mentioned before around like the best use for these data right now is a trigger to start a conversation that might never have been started because you weren't even thinking about these things. And so it's not to say like if you have a certain value come up, you need to change something straight away or like start an intervention. It's more just like, oh, okay, that's like a yellow flag to have a conversation. It's not necessarily a red flag. And so it's just helping you instead of I need to have a conversation with every patient every week. It's saying maybe like I need to talk to this person this week because I've seen something there. And then it just saves you like the time and energy that way.
Yeah. And that like, I guess lost for words, what you just said, because I've been wanting to ask this question just to someone with your amount of knowledge, because we have a lot of friends and even patients that we see that definitely report that they don't want to use this data because they can go off field, which I completely understand, and there's problems with the data and things like that. However, what would you say for someone that doesn't like objective scores? And I'm thinking of Amy, who doesn't really like measuring heart rate and things like that. Do you think it's a blind spot of them where they could improve their performance or recovery, things like heart rate and HRV and things like that? Or do you think they're probably better off just sticking with field? Because I do know there's that minority of athletes that just do seem to know.
Yeah, I definitely would think like any of the best athletes I've worked with, they have cultivated that sense over time where they can almost tell themselves, but I almost think they've almost trained themselves to get to that point. And for me, I think it's an interesting process to go through. Maybe you open your app in the morning and you see your HRV, and then you sort of like check in with yourself and you're like, well, how do I feel? Like, what are the sensations I'm experiencing? And you start to connect over time. Like when it's low, I feel a certain way, and you're kind of building, it's almost like a kind of muscle memory over time until you get to a point where, you know, you're almost like training that ability yourself. It's interesting. There's actually kind of a research test you can do, because they refer to it as interoception, is the sense of knowing how your body, like your inner body is responding. So there's an interoceptive ability test you can do, which is without any measurement devices on. You just kind of sit still and like try and listen almost to your inner body and count your heart rate. So if you had to try and do that, you might say, oh, I'm at 60 beats per minute. And then you actually measure it as well, and you see how close you are to it. And you're just trying to like listen to, like, can you hear your heartbeat? And like, that's, it's not like a foolproof test, obviously, but that's an interesting one that you might be interested to do with some of these people, to see how close they actually get to maybe say like, yeah, you are really in touch with yourself or not. And I do think it is something that you can potentially train over time by, as I say, like trying to dock in, how do you feel when you see these numbers? Until potentially maybe you don't even need to see the numbers anymore. You just kind of wake up and you know, but they can help you get there faster than if you didn't have that objective data.
Yeah, that's good.
I can certainly see, like in myself, that that's something that I've learned over time.
Previously, I would ignore all my feelings of how I actually felt and just kind of go and train anyways. And I've had a pretty rough history of being notoriously injured. And so I think from that experience, I feel like my perception of feel is a lot better now. I definitely do feel a lot more in tune with how I truly do feel. But is it something that you think is learnt over time, or do some people have an ability to sort of tune into that without practicing it, or really giving it a bit of time and energy to I guess listen to that feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it like there would be like some natural variation between different people in terms of how they're able to do that. And I think another really interesting thing is almost like sometimes you kind of know, but you kid yourself into thinking like, I want to train anyway. And so I think there's like that element of it too. And I think sometimes what the data does, it gives you an extra bit of accountability. Or if you have someone else like a coach looking at it, then they're saying to you like, hey, you sure you really feel that good today? I mean, one of the biggest examples I think about is like when someone's ill and they're thinking like, should I train? Should I not train? And if you can see, like, you pull up the body temperature data and you see like, oh, it's spiked a lot, like, okay, you really shouldn't actually train today, versus like, oh no, I just feel like I have a bit of a sniffle, like maybe I can do something, it's a bit lower intensity. And you have that objective data that kind of either validates your training decision or just makes you think twice about like, yeah, should I really listen to myself or not? So I think it's like that two-step process.
Totally. I can certainly put myself in a guilty position for ignoring all of those feelings in the past, and now definitely paying a lot more attention to how I do feel. So yeah, I think it's very helpful for things like that, for sure. Yeah,
it's interesting, like, because we like doing triathlon and racing, and we probably love running more, and probably you reckon runners are the most that we see, athletes? Yeah, probably endurance runners. And I've seen this problem, and it's happened to me a couple of times, when you wake up you do everything right all week the day before to try and get your like readiness or recovery score, 98%. And you wake up the morning of the race and it's like 50 or 40 or 30. And I know, like, doing my own research and understanding that there's plenty of metrics it uses, but it's quite kind of deceiving, and it can make you feel, kind of crappy. Yeah, what would you say, like, how would you navigate that if you're an athlete and you do wake up and it's like, hey, my recovery is 40 and I'm meant to run, my fastest half marathon today?
Yeah. I actually think, if we come back to HRV for a second, there's actually some kind of evidence to suggest it's because your body's responding to stress. Like, that could be a response about you being nervous and kind of overthinking that score, if you see what I mean. And so like there's that side of things as well, which doesn't mean you're not prepared. It's just reflecting like a different kind of stress. And so one of the things that I always used to think about with athletes is like, we all have times where you slept badly, but you actually can perform well. or you're sore and then you start doing something and you actually can perform well. And so I almost like to try and train them to like use the score to give them confidence to say, like, even if it's 50, you can still perform well because you've done it before. And so actually, no matter what it is, you kind of still have that level of confidence and you're able to ignore it if you want to. Another thing that we sometimes would do is actually just not show those scores to people, like build dashboards for athletes where they don't see it. Like it comes to like a sports scientist or the coaches, and you only show it to them if you want to show it to them. And it's oftentimes to like give them confidence rather than to actually really give them the score. So it's all part of that like psychological preparation. And so I think again, that's something that you can train in people, because there's like two elements to your stress response. There's like what the stressful stimulus actually is, and then there's how you respond to it. And so like you can control that one more. And so you can kind of train yourself to do that over time by saying, yeah, even though my score's low, like I know I can still perform well. So whatever, I'm going to kind of get out there and crush it. And you can do that because you've done it before.
Yeah, I've got a race this weekend. I've got Port Macquarie half Ironman, and I always sleep so terribly the night before a race. So I'm going to go into it this weekend with your words in mind. Like, it doesn't matter.
And it really
honestly, don't open it on the race day. Like, because you don't need, like, it's not going to change anything about, you're not going to change the fact that you're doing a half Ironman. You're still going to do it. Like I would say, look at it after, or just, you don't have to look at it every day.
I can just look at it instead, and unless it's in the green, I won't give it to you. I say it's in the green, don't worry about it.
Or and like another thing we would sometimes do is like the coaches would look at it and the score's actually really bad, but they would tell the athletes it's really good to just to give them that like psychological belief that like, I'm well prepared kind of thing. And then it's almost like it can be a placebo effect in a way, which if it works, it works. It's not doing any harm really. So you can do that.
Like, even because I just keep like with the races that we do, generally it's like you'll get to a certain heart rate, and you've got to say your goal heart rate for the race. So you might do the half marathon at 170 beats for that time, or that's kind of your goal. Like if I wear an Apple Watch. Most of the people in the Tri Club wear a Garmin. Some people wear Polar. Like, is there much variation between all those devices? And I mean, obviously, then you've got Whoop, but you can't see that in the race. But if Kelly and I were running a 10K and she was using Garmin, I was using Apple Watch, would you expect the heart rate to be pretty different? Like in just the way, I guess, the result that it gives?
Yeah, so the most accurate ones would be from the chest strap that's reading onto the watch. So that would probably be like the gold standard in the field. And then from different studies that have been done, the best PPG based device seems to be the Apple Watch. So that seems to be the most accurate compared to like a Whoop or a Fitbit or just a Garmin that reads through the wrist. And so that for like something that's like steady state, like running or cycling, like the Apple Watch is pretty good. Obviously it's not as good as the chest strap, but then like from what I've seen in more like, I don't know, high intensity kind of interval workouts or circuit training or strength training, it struggles a bit more just because of like there's a lot of changes that it doesn't necessarily always capture. So for steady state stuff, like Apple, would be like the best one that's not a chest strap.
Yeah, I compare the two after a run, say, and there's not really ever any variation, or maybe just like one beat in terms of my average heart rate at the end of a run. So I often think that they must be relatively accurate if they're both reporting the exact same number. That's my train of thought. I don't know how accurate.
Yeah, that's what I've seen in the research. I mean, there's those individual differences for some people, like it might not translate for them, but generally on the whole, like that's what's been shown.
Yeah. Now I've been like stalking your Twitter like a hawk for probably the last 6 months and reading and just some of the dialogue between you and some of the other people on there, and like the readiness score. And I don't know if you said this or someone else said this. The data that like Whoop and the Oura Ring collect, you're not able to access the pure data. Is that right? They just give you the algorithm, or they put the data into an algorithm, which then gives you, the readiness score. Is that right?
Yeah. So both of those companies have different proprietary algorithms for what goes into the score, which they're proprietary algorithms, so they don't share exactly how the score is created. But what they have shared is the metrics that go into it, but we just don't know in what proportion. So they're using things like HRV, sleep, resting heart rate, all of those metrics. So it is the metrics that you can see. You just don't know how they're combined into this score. And so in some senses, it makes it hard to interpret, especially because you have such a mixture of things in there. So you have like a raw kind of physiological metric of how your body's responding, like HRV. And then you have something like sleep, which is more of a behavior that you've engaged in. And so you don't necessarily know like the context behind each of them. And they've just kind of like mushed it together and put it into one score it's almost then hiding the details that you want to see to really figure out what's going on.
Yeah, because it's like if I have like Wednesday, I do a double run day, and I've always got like a really high strain on Whoop, and before I go to bed, it'll show you, I guess, my sleep coach, and it will say, due to recent strain, you should have maybe an extra hour and 30, how long it takes to get to sleep and things like that. So, and even the people that I work with in the clinic, they didn't really understand that. And I wanted to ask you if it's really worthwhile. If you've had a bigger day of training and you obviously are trying to recover, is it beneficial to get more sleep, or is it kind of that diminishing returns? If you sleep over 8.5 hours, it's not that much better for you. Because my Whoop will say, sometimes I should get 10 hours of sleep due to my recent strain. Whereas I know the athletes I see just like, oh yeah, no matter what I do, if I've run a marathon or done nothing that day, I still just get my 8 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think is very individual as well. So it is pretty hard to say. And I think there has been some research to show there potentially is like a point of diminishing returns where too much sleep can kind of impair your performance almost. So there's probably like a sweet spot for everyone, which is one of the things I think is interesting about these scores, that they're quite generic. Like they're not taking into consideration that your goal could be something very different to other people. Like you're asking the question of like, what am I ready for? Or what am I trying to recover from? And for you, doing like an Ironman is very different to someone else who's playing like a rugby sevens tournament and they want to like have another game in 2 hours, versus like you're just training every day towards something that's like months or weeks in the future. And so to have one score to sort of try and answer all of those different kind of goals and situations is really tricky.
Yeah.
And this is, I think both. So my mum, I don't know, your mum's got a Garmin, hasn't she?
She has a Fitbit.
Yeah, it seems that Fitbit, like the older generation, and talking kind of on the topic of sleep, trust, like we obviously know we can't trust them 100%, but my family, like this is the Bible. Whatever it says she slept, and trying to explain that it's not completely accurate unless it's like a polysomnography tracking your sleep. Like how does it track sleep? Is it just based off heart rate or?
Yeah, so I mean, the metrics that it can take are kind of somewhat limited for sleep because it's got heart rate in there, or like that kind of pulse signal, and then accelerometry, which is movement as well. So it's a lot based on if you're lying still trying to sleep, it oftentimes thinks you're asleep because all of the signals that it collects indicate that, versus the best sleep trackers that I've tried, they're headbands, and they measure your brain activity. And so that's basically the variable that can distinguish whether you're just lying down or whether you're actually asleep. And so it's really hard for something on the wrist or the finger to be able to do that really accurately, just because it's not measuring the right raw signals. So they generally tend to be good for knowing like, oh yeah, like you roughly went to sleep for this long, like you went to sleep at this time, you woke up at this time. But in terms of like detecting, are you in deep sleep, are you in REM sleep, those kinds of things, like that's a lot harder just from those variables, versus like if you have that brain activity, it can say like, oh, you're in this stage, or you're not, with like a bit more accuracy. The only problem is you're like wearing something on your head and it's like much less comfortable. So there's like a big trade-off. So there's oftentimes a trade-off between the accuracy that you get from these things and then like how easy it is to use them or how easy it is to wear them.
Yeah, because like, it just makes me think, if it's like, obviously it's limited with its accuracy, if it's predicting my readiness or how ready I am to take on strain based off sleep, I would like to know how much sleep goes into that score. Like, I mean, just an argument, let's say it was 50% of the score and it's not that accurate, like it can really obviously sway that readiness result for sure.
Yeah, completely. I think that's one of the biggest problems with those kind of scores. Like, we don't know what proportion of or weighting it's giving to each variable, which is why I always think it's more informative to look at those like raw variables yourself, because then you have a bit of an idea of like, how was my sleep, how was my HRV, how is my respiratory rate, all of those other variables, and you can kind of look at them and understand in a bit more detail what's going on and why it might be going on.
Yeah. Does the heart rate, just thinking even for the Apple Watch or the Garmin, does swimming change it much? Like going underwater and things, like does it affect the result, or it's fine?
I think from what I've seen, it's fine. I think it would only be if you were like scuba diving or something below a certain depth, then it might change. But I think definitely I've used Garmin like in open water swimming, and that's been fine.
Yeah. Now, biggest question of the whole podcast, and do you think in the future that these devices will be able to have somewhat of an input in predicting injury? Because even like in the running space and in the sporting space, no matter any functional tests we do or anything like that, the research is probably more swayed to we can't predict injury, but there doesn't seem to be, despite what we see on Instagram and Facebook, there's nothing really that we have that we can objectively use to say, hey, with this metric, you're probably going to get injured, or you're more likely or significantly more likely. Do you think that these devices could possibly maybe change that in the future?
Yeah, this is definitely a hot topic in the sports performance research. And one of the ways I like to think about it is kind of like a statistical nuance, whereby prediction is saying like yes or no, you're going to get injured. And then forecasting is saying there's a 60% chance you might get injured. And I think the second one, forecasting, is like much more advanced or much better than the actual prediction side of things, because we know injury is a complex phenomenon. We will never be able to measure all the variables that go into it. I think just by the nature of how machine learning models work, the more input variables we have, the better they should be able to get at forecasting that risk. So if we have like external load, we have screening tests, we have all of these physiological variables, you put them in a model, they should be able to improve kind of the accuracy of those forecasts. The other thing that is often really hard with injuries, and this is in sports teams, is like if you track them throughout a year, you don't actually have that many injuries compared to kind of injury-free days. And so if you're trying to predict something in a machine learning model, you need a lot of events to be able to build up like that data and the robustness of those models. So you either have to pool data between loads of athletes or monitor for like years and years, which probably explains why we haven't really got to a good point yet in terms of being able to do that. But I think the technology is there, that it will get better. Whether it will ever be perfect, I don't think it will. But for me, it's more about like making you a little bit less wrong in some of those decisions, like just giving you a bit more information to like make better decisions or better calls. But even then, it's really interesting, because I'm like, oh, if you knew that some like an AFL player had like a 90% chance of getting injured in a game, but it was like the grand final, are you going to tell them like don't play because you might get injured? Or it's like unethical, but then it might be your best player, so you really want to play them anyway. So like there's all sorts of like considerations like that, which are super interesting.
That's a good answer. That makes me excited. Do you think because I don't really know of many around us or people that we work with that really use these sorts of metrics with patients? Like, this is just talking from like a healthcare setting. Do you think that they are underutilized in
healthcare, and how can health professionals add value to the care of patients through the use of
wearable technology?
Yeah, 100%. I think they are. And I probably imagine it's because if as you're trained as a sports medicine or a medical professional in general, you probably never encounter this stuff, at least right now. And so then it's kind of new to you. But I think where it can probably have the most powerful effect is just from a kind of personalization perspective, like you're treating each athlete or patient as an individual, because everyone has such wildly different data, and you're able to assess their individual responses to any interventions that you might try or anything like that. And one of the things that I always think about in terms of this is there was a research study done in Israel in 2015, and they used those continuous glucose monitors to look at individual responses to different foods. And they found that they could feed two different people the same food, like a banana. One person's glucose went really high, the other person just didn't respond at all. And so there's like these myths that like, yeah, something like a banana spikes your glucose, but then individual responses are actually like really variable. And so I think that's really interesting from a healthcare perspective of like, we kind of know what generally we would prescribe to people, but there's so much individual variation and different factors that go into these things that it's actually just better to look at like the level of the individual. What does their data say? How are they responding? So you can fine tune for them rather than just prescribing like generic things that, you know, tend to work well, but don't always work well for each specific person.
And just kind of test and trial to see how they respond, which obviously takes time, but I mean, that's really the best way we've got to see, like giving them an intervention to see how they respond and then, you know, changing if they don't respond well, because otherwise, if everyone's going to behave differently, it makes it really hard. But like, even with heart rate, I'm just thinking of a patient I had this week that was coming back from like a bone stress injury, and we're just doing a basic like return to running program and using like the zones, like zone 1 and zone 2, zone 3 to zone 5, and thinking how to structure their return to running. And we didn't want to do really any intensity or any volume, and just giving them a metric kind of to use. And I just said, basically just staying in zone 1 for all your running. We're doing like some walk run intervals, but do you think that's got any merit, just using heart rate basically as a metric rather than saying, just go out and do an easy run? Just say, hey, go out and keep in zone 1, which is obviously they've got their individual zones. But yeah, what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives people something to anchor it to. And again, that confirmation of like, yes, I'm doing it right. And so it's helping them stick to the prescription, but it's also like, I think that data gives you a bit more validation in terms of confidence and belief in like, yes, I'm doing something and it's working. I may not be like running at 100%, but look, I've, you know, got the data to prove it. But I don't think you necessarily like, you have to make people feel that they have to have that. Because I even think with the example that you shared, like you could do the same thing just from paying attention to someone's breathing rate, because that has a really strong correlation between effort and how fast you're actually going as well. So you could like just tell people to tune into that if they don't have a heart rate monitor or they don't want to buy one. There's like ways and means to do it for different people. But I do think as a tool to give people like the confidence that they're doing it right, it can be really helpful.
Yeah, but it's just not as cool though, because you don't have all these cool numbers in a big spreadsheet to look at. The breathing's cool, but it's just awesome to see like, and I follow all my athletes on Strava, and you can just, I don't know what it is. Obviously, I would think that you would feel the same. It's just awesome to see that raw data, because you just sometimes people say, yeah, the run was good, or it was a recovery run, it was an easy run, and then you look at the heart rate and it's not. And it's like, do you know that there's this huge difference or this disparity between what you're feeling and what your body's actually feeling?
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think that like the data is that trigger point for the conversation. And maybe that's like education. And then it's like over time, you kind of keep doing it and you can help train people to like have that sense themselves and like retrain that interoception so that they, like don't need to look at the data every single time. They just kind of like get better over time at doing it themselves.
Yeah, I've done a couple of runs and like looking at the data the whole time. Like if I ever run on the treadmill and it's pouring rain, I'll like set my phone up and you can have like a live coach with Whoop. And you'll be running and looking down at the zones, and like my neck gets sore because I'm constantly looking at it. Like, this is not sustainable at all. It's cool, but it's definitely not sustainable to see it move and things like that between the zones. Yeah, they have
there's all sorts of interesting technology in this space that I've seen. There's like sunglasses that they'll have like voice control coaching in there, and that like can like pick up data from your wearable and then like give you the kind of real-time like coaching information using artificial intelligence and stuff like that. And the same with headphones, because actually I think kind of some of the next generation of wearables will be like measuring things around your ear, because there's a really good blood supply there. And so people are working on things like you can measure heart rate through headphones, like in your ear. And so then imagine you could get like audio instructions through the headphones as well about like, this is your heart rate, or you're in the right zone, or you're not, like that kind of thing. So I think all of these things will start to kind of come to market in the next few years.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so cool. That's so cool.
Yeah, what the future holds, you just have no idea. Hey, like you say things like that, you would never think of it. You say, you're like, wow, that's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one that's in the same way as I mentioned, those continuous glucose sensors. People are looking at building continuous lactate sensors. So before, you would have to take a blood sample to measure someone's lactate or glucose to give you kind of a metric of how hard they're working during exercise, but you could potentially get that continuously through this kind of sensor, as again, like another a metric, like heart rate, of how kind of hard they're finding the exercise.
Yeah, because even like Chris, I don't know if you've heard, there's a guy named Christian Blumenfeld who like just broke one of the Ironman world record, and it was like a ridiculous amount of I think he was out for like 7 hours and 12 minutes, and like his heart rate was and anyway, all the triathlon magazines and all the media has been reporting on him, and they've just been saying his coach, I think who's the coach? Is it Ollie? Ollie Ulfgar? I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he was on the podcast talking about all the data that they're taking on him. And in any videos, you'll see him with the monitoring on, and he trains with it. And they're just they were saying that they were like measuring something from his like feces and his urine. It was just like incredible. So I'd love to see, and obviously they're not going to release it, but once he breaks all the sub-7, I hope they release all the data that they took on him, because they said it's just absolutely incredible everything they're measuring. And I wonder what they're using, because it's obviously going to be able to be used while he's training. I guess you can do it in a lab and stuff, but yeah, it'd be cool to see what data they were getting from his wearables, in quotation marks.
Yeah, I think those things are really interesting, because I think what you often find is like you have those case studies of like the best athletes, and then more of that stuff starts to filter down and be made more accessible to like everyone. And so it'll be interesting to see like, if you could show like this really worked, and then let's make it available to more people and kind of share how they did it and how they used it, so that like loads of other triathletes and other athletes can use it as well.
I'd just be rocking up to work with just all these silver things down my arm, and like, this does lactate, this does glucose, this does this.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's the other thing, like you want to have as many kind of things integrated, so you're just wearing like one thing. But I mean, some of the other stuff that I've sort of seen potentially in the future is like things that would be implanted into your skin, basically, like almost like a microchip, so that you wouldn't even have to wear anything or see it. And I mean, that comes with a load of other kind of ethical considerations and risks and those kinds of things. But potentially, like, that's where some of these things are going. And that would allow you to measure different things, because you're kind of like under the skin rather than just on top of the skin. So there's all sorts potentially.
Yeah, it's the old question, like if I'm with patient, and it always seems to be at the end of the appointment, I'll be typing something up and we'll just be chatting, and they'll just go, why do you have 2 watches? And just look at me really funny. And then if they don't know anything about, obviously the Apple Watch is easy to explain, but then I'm trying to explain the Whoop, and I'm like, it does this, it does that. It's meant to unlock my human performance, in quotation marks. Then I'll get out the phone and show them, and it's like, I can definitely see it coming. Just more, I guess, used by the athletic population, but again, people still have never heard of it.
Yeah, just to quickly, you just triggered a thought. What about like in the general population or on non-athletic people? Do you see a use for some of these wearables, or do you think that that's something that could be like an indication of their general health, or I don't know? What what's there?
Yeah, absolutely. There are even some simple measures that correlate really well with things like all-cause mortality and kind of like risk of getting chronic diseases and that kind of thing. Just simple things like how active you are during the day. And I think that's probably more of the like Fitbit kind of 10,000 steps market, and that it can almost be like the kind of gateway drug to wearables as it were, because that's something that most people are familiar with, and then they get as they kind of get into it, they get more in tune with like, oh, sleep and maybe heart rate and those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, one of the other variables that people are looking at building into some of these devices right now is blood pressure. And that is so well related to many conditions like cardiovascular and other kind of health conditions. And so I think as you get more and more of these variables that are relevant from a general health perspective, it will start to be even more relevant for kind of the general public. And probably like one of the interesting things over here in North America is the way the insurance system works. And so if you can almost prove that you're like healthy using some of your data, you could potentially pay like lower premiums and that kind of thing. So I think that model might start to drive more kind of use and uptake of these devices as well.
Yeah, as soon as money gets involved and insurance companies.
Yeah, there's an incentive for different people who weren't bothered before. So yeah, that could be interesting.
Yeah. But how does like the Garmin, because I know, and I have never worn a Garmin, I know you have, it would give you a readiness score and it would give you a...
It didn't give a readiness score. It would, after say like a run, it would say that you need 48 hours of recovery or something.
Yeah, and then sometimes it would suggest a workout too, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Is that same thing, just feeds into an algorithm and just gives you a result or something to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's another of their kind of proprietary algorithms where you don't necessarily know what's feeding into it and how it's producing that score. And obviously there's lots of things it doesn't know about you as well. So I've seen some crazy things like come back from those algorithms that I wouldn't really pay too much attention or read into it too much. There was one I saw someone posted on Twitter the other day, and they'd run a 5K and they'd run it in, let's say they'd run 16 minutes. And then the Garmin prediction came up and it says your predicted 5K time is 18 minutes. And he's like, I just ran one in 16 minutes. So I don't know what you're doing. So there's all sorts of kind of quirks with it that, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, to be honest.
Yeah, right.
It's hard. Like I can just really see it. I guess knowing the athlete and knowing how they interpret data, but just kind of their personality as to whether they should use it. Like in the general case of a sporting team, do you think it's better that you have like a dashboard that all the data goes to and then you just feed it to the athletes, or that they report it, or what do you think is best there?
I think definitely at the elite level, it's really a case-by-case basis, depending on who the athlete is and how they respond to these kinds of things. Because some people see data and they'll freak out. They're like, oh, my sleep score is really bad. So then they'll sleep worse because of that. Versus some people who, they're not overly bothered by that. So I think there's really like an individual case there. And I think it depends what you're trying to achieve as well, because you might not want to show everyone 50 variables. It might just be confusing. You might just be working on improving the sleep of one player. And so you just show them like the one or two things that are important for that. Because I think there's a real risk of like being overloaded by information from all the things that you can measure, and almost putting people in this state of like decision fatigue or like cognitive overload, where it's just like, oh, it's too hard, so I won't do anything. I'll just like carry on doing what I'm doing. So I think you kind of have to be a bit smart about that as well. If you're showing things to people, make sure if they only take one thing away from it, what do you want that to be, and start there. And then maybe you build on top of that if you want to. But if you can only guarantee one thing, like that's what I always say to start with. And you can check them by asking like, what did you actually take away from this? And if it's not that one thing, you probably need to rethink what's on your dashboard.
Yeah. Well, so what's your recommendation out of everything out there? And I don't know if you've got bias, if you're allowed to say, would you say like the Whoop or the Oura Ring? Definitely said Apple Watch is good for heart rate, or Garmin or Polar. So Polar for the strap, Apple Watch for heart rate. And then what do you think from like an Oura Ring Whoop? Because I know on your Twitter, it was probably more the Oura Ring, because you said the Whoop was a little bit inconsistent.
Yeah, and I mean, Whoop, they have released their latest version now, which like wasn't part of that analysis, so it could well be a lot better. So there's always that to take into consideration as well. These things are being improved and changed all the time, so you kind of have to like try and keep up to speed with that. But in general, I mean, I think there isn't one thing that does everything really well. So you are looking at like, what's your goal, or what is it that you really do want to measure? And for exercise heart rate, chest strap, if you want it to be super accurate. If you don't want to wear a chest strap, you still want the best accuracy, the Apple Watch. then for like nightly sleep and HRV, like personally, I found Aura to be the most valuable in terms of accuracy in the data it gives me, and also the easiest to wear because it's on the finger. I find it easier to wear than like it's something on your wrist, because you're sometimes kind of sleeping on your wrist like that. But again, that's like personal preference as well. And so in general, that's kind of where my preferences go to. But I always say to people, like, you know, it's worth trying these things for you to find out what works for you, because of some of the things that we spoke about. Like, you can have individual differences in skin tone or blood circulation where you wear these things that mean that some of these devices don't actually work for you. There's another one that's better. So I wouldn't say like, yes, just get this one. I would say generally this is what I recommend, but it's worth trying it for you and seeing what works. And if it doesn't work, move on to something else and find what works for you.
It's funny, like when we first started as clinicians, and even like finishing off with research now, you know, when I was younger, it was like, it's either this or nothing, but then realizing that everything kind of sits in the gray area. It's like, the Whoop's not better than the Aura. It's like, depending on this and this and this, and then it's
I know, it's very inconvenient, but that's kind of the most honest answer I think I can give.
Yeah. And you know how like people on social media or Instagram, Facebook, like, this is the one you need, this is why, don't ever go anything else. And it's like, I just don't think it's that easy. But obviously you get more engagement if it's like that.
Yeah, exactly. I would be skeptical of those things as well, because oftentimes people have an agenda behind what they're saying. So I think if something's black and white, there's probably something going on. So
until you get to the bottom of it and it's like, this is my discount code, by the way. You're like, okay, that
exactly.
Yeah. All right. That was awesome. So what's your plans in the future moving forward? Are you not coming out with your own Whoop version?
Yeah, no, very unlikely. I think it's very hard to build. Like these products are really hard to build because they're building hardware and software, which is pretty unique in this kind of world. I'm just trying to keep up to date with the research and testing them out myself to kind of find what's most valuable for me. And so just like looking at the data and kind of like new developments in terms of different variables that might be measured soon, and then also the different form factors that I mentioned. So maybe devices that you can wear around your ear or around your neck, or like various different body parts and those kinds of things, and just kind of interested to see what comes up and test it to see what can be learned from it.
Yeah. And then obviously your Twitter is just a knowledge exchange. It's great. And some of the dialogue on there, it's really, really interesting to read. And I think it's like we were saying before, nothing's black and white. It's good to just read. There's another guy on Twitter, Alan. I can't remember his little picture. Yeah. Between you and him, I can just sit there on the lounge and just read for a couple of hours. It's awesome. Just scrolling through the Twitter.
Yeah, he has amazing content around like training, especially for triathletes and Ironman and training zones and exercise physiology and all of those kinds of things. And yeah, I think like you touched on it, there's so much like nuance to these conversations, which when you're kind of deep in it is super valuable to kind of understand, like, hey, this is what's going on, this is why it might be going on, so I'm gonna try this out, see if it works. If not, come back, try something else. I think definitely, like, I've had so many conversations with many of my friends who don't necessarily have a background in any of this stuff, and I've seen like how the questions that they have and how valuable it can be. And so that's just why I'm trying to share some of the things that I do know, because I am sort of privileged to have a bit of a background in this stuff, and try and just make that more accessible to people, because oftentimes you don't necessarily get that from specific products, or you don't get that unless you're reading journal articles, and they're not accessible to most people. So the more we can do to kind of spread that knowledge, the better, I think.
Yeah, and just even understanding some of the articles is also a challenge.
Yeah, it's also like a foreign language.
The data that I've got.
Yeah, 100%.
What do you think, like the elite sporting teams, do you think that like they're using, obviously not using these, I don't think so, like they're just doing it like you were saying, how you were doing it kind of in 2012, just taking it manually?
No, look, there are many teams using like a lot of these different devices and testing them. And yeah, some of them, it depends on what you'd like. If you're going on altitude camps and things, you're probably doing more kind of manually, because you just want to get higher fidelity of what you're doing. But if you have a squad of like 50 players, it's really hard to do that. So if you have one or two athletes, you probably have a different approach to if you have 50 or 60 athletes in the big team sports. So yeah, I would say a lot of like elite teams are kind of using some of these similar things, but potentially just using the data in different ways, or looking at it differently against like other types of data that they have.
Yeah, great. Pardon me. All right. Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any parting quotes, words of wisdom, anything like that you would like to leave some of the listeners with?
Yeah, I think just in general, if something potentially seems too good to be true, it probably is. So I would say, like, be optimistic and be curious and be excited about all this stuff, but also be a bit skeptical as well. And like, don't be afraid to ask, like, hey, what does this actually mean? Or you don't have to follow something a device says, like, to the T if it doesn't feel right for you. So yeah, just kind of like use it to heighten your awareness to what's going on for you, and like be curious and ask those questions. Don't feel like it's black and white and you have to follow it like a book.
Yeah, I wish it made my predicted 5K at like 13 minutes. I'd take that. I'd be happy with that.
Exactly. You'd probably go and do it then, right?
All righty. Thank you so much for coming on.
That was awesome.
No worries. Thanks for having me.